One of the things I've learned from more than 20 years of working in child development in Azerbaijan is that how a child develops is often very similar to how a country develops. I think there's a strong correlation. And I believe that if you want to change society, you have to change how you raise your children. The early years, commonly 0 to 5, these are considered the foundation years for a child's whole future development. This is a time when their brains are forming, and their brains form by millions of neural pathways joining together with every new experience that the child has. So everything they see, everything they hear, everything they touch, everything they experience creates these neural pathways, and the brain just gets bigger and bigger as a result. So that's why it's so important in the early years to create as much opportunity for your child to see, hear, touch, smell, talk, as many different experiences as possible, because then you're contributing to a bigger, more connected brain that then forms the foundation for all future brain development. Whereas in a child where they've had very minimal attention or minimal interaction with adults, in those early years, their brain development is significantly reduced, and there's plenty of scientific research and brain scans and so on to prove that, to show it. So that's why the early years are so important for all children. Well, children go through stages of development from birth. So the first 6 months, they're feeling everything. It's a sensory stage, so that's why you often see babies put everything to their mouths, because that's how they're learning what something is. And all the skin is a huge sensory organ that's feeding all this information to the brain. So first 6 months of a child's life, they're just touching, feeling, learning who they are in relation to their environment. Then they go through this exploratory phase where they're trying to figure out what everything is. So that's when you see children start to break things, open things, crawl into everything, because they're trying to explore. And through this exploration, they're opening their minds. They're starting to think at a very basic level. Then they get into a construction phase where they're starting to make things. This is where their creativity, their imagination starts to really develop. And then they move into the social phase. And this is usually about 2.5 years old, which is often the time when children go to kindergarten. Because in this social stage, this is when they're starting to learn to play with other children. They're learning to share. So they're learning empathy and tolerance at that age, because they're playing with kids, and you see the classic fight between two children over one toy. But they have to go through that fight because they're learning how to share, how to give and take. And if they don't learn that at that age, it's unlikely they're going to learn it as they get older. And you can imagine what an adult is like who hasn't learnt creativity, imagination, sharing, empathy as a child. They're not going to develop those characteristics particularly easily as an adult if they haven't experienced it as a child. So that's why this sort of early years education, kindergarten, preschool, so valuable, especially for children from low-income families. This tends to be it's not a judgment, it's not a fault, but often people in low-income families, they're very stressed. They're more concerned about how to feed the family, or they may not be there because they're working all the time. And so the child from a low-income family is often doesn't get the attention that he or she may need. And this contributes to less development, delayed development, particularly in speech, because if somebody's not talking to the child, explaining what things are, playing with the child isn't learning. Child learns speech from seeing their parents mimicking them. Parent says, "Oh, look at this blue car." The child is learning what a blue car is because the parent is explaining it to them verbally. And so if a child isn't getting that experience with their own parents or with other adults in the family, their learning is delayed. And we've seen that in our work. We did a survey a couple of years ago of children 0 to 4 years old, not disabled, typical children. And we found that 34% of these children were delayed, particularly in their speech and communication, because they weren't getting enough interaction with family when they were young, and they're not going to preschool or kindergarten, so they're not socialising with other children. And this is having an impact on their development. So that's why preschool, particularly for low-income families, is so valuable for their child, because it will help them to catch up on that developmental delay. One of the things I've learned from more than 20 years of working in child development in Azerbaijan is that how a child develops is often very similar to how a country develops. I think there's a strong correlation. And I believe that if you want to change society, you have to change how you raise your children. So if you're always telling your children, no, be quiet, sit down, don't move, don't do this, don't touch that, you're a girl, you mustn't be doing that, you're a boy, don't cry. What kind of society are you creating if that is the way you're raising children? So how we talk to our children, how we pass our judgments or society's judgments onto our children does then perpetuate how society continues to treat male, females, children. And the gender issue is particularly worrying, because when we try and put people into these stereotypes, male stereotypes, female stereotypes, if that child isn't identifying in that way at all, doesn't feel that they are a pretty little girl in pink who sits quietly, but we're making them, then this is going to really affect that child's confidence, self-esteem. They may grow up, they'll either grow up so broken that they will just sit there quietly, or they will rebel. And none of us want children who rebel, because then that takes them into drugs, alcohol, and all sorts of behaviour that can harm them. So by trying to enclose a child or oppress a child, we can create a lot of unknown damage to that child as he or she grows up. It's a process. So in the UK, men and women had those very clearly defined roles until the Second World War, when all the men went off to war and women had to work in the factories. When the men came back from war, the women were like, "Oh, I'm not stopping. I'm enjoying this." So this changed the gender roles, where women suddenly were able to choose how they wanted to live their lives, to be independent, to earn money, not just be at home, look after the children. And then obviously the government and legislation and policies just emphasised that, allowed that process to continue. So I do think in a country where the government doesn't put barriers in a women's place, that is a country that will follow that process of development and grow, prosperous, economically diverse. And I think in Azerbaijan, you're in that situation. The government encourages women actively, empowers women. There are many women in powerful positions here. And so everything is in place to allow women to grow and develop themselves. I think women now need to learn that they can, and there's nothing to stop them, and they need to start overcoming these social barriers around them and start living their own lives. As people, as adults, start learning more about how children learn and how they develop, then as adults we start to understand more about the psychological damage we often do without realising it. For example, when we compare our child to somebody else's child, "Oh, look at little Emin, look how great he is in mathematics, I wish you would be like him." As a parent, you may think that you're encouraging and motivating your child, but often it has the opposite effect. It leads to confidence issues, low self-esteem. Maybe the child just gives up and thinks, "I'll never be like Emin, so I'm not even going to try." Yeah. So I think as a parent, as adults, we need to understand a lot more about the psychological damage that we can cause to our children by not knowing how they react to the things that we say to them, how it impacts on their psychological development. So as we learn more, we understand the value of tolerance. We're all different. We all look different. We all think different. And so comparing ourselves to somebody else or comparing our children to other people's children, it never produces a positive impact, or rarely does. But to produce a positive impact as a parent, you've really got to know your child very well. You really got to be able to observe and analyse a situation to know whether the words you come out with will actually motivate your child or not. But if you don't really know your child that well, or you don't really understand child psychology particularly, you could be doing a lot of damage. And our role as parents is to raise our kids to be as independent as possible, independent, confident, and so on. So these childhood years are the times when we should be encouraging them and telling them that they can do anything that they put their mind to, that they should try, they shouldn't be scared. We should encourage them to be, thinking about what they want to do in life themselves, what makes them, what interests them, what motivates them, not trying to push them into a role that we think that they should be playing. I remember many years ago, I was travelling to Ganja. My son was about 3 years old. We were travelling by plane, and we were in the little waiting room waiting for the plane to come. And there were a lot of other parents and young children in there, all Azerbaijani. And they were all just sitting quietly, not saying a word, not moving. And my son was up, down, talking non-stop, and I'm looking at him and I'm looking at these other kids going, what is this, And I could have told him to shut up, sit down, be quiet, don't move, or smack him or something. But I understood enough about child development to know that that's not a good idea. And then I was talking with my colleague and said, what is this difference? And she said to me, our children are being raised to be good Soviet citizens, to do what they're told and be in their place. I mean, she was smiling when she was telling this, but there's a strong truth in that, because not long out of the Soviet Union. My point is about independence. Independence in children. As long as we keep telling them what to do or where to sit or to be quiet, they will either do that or they will rebel. What we want are independent children who can look after themselves and look after their own families. And we have to encourage that independence in them as a child. Let them make mistakes, because it's through mistakes that they learn. If they go completely in a direction that we think is not right for them, they still need to go. They need to learn that for themselves. Otherwise, if we do their homework for them every day, how are they learning? They need to learn this themselves. Going outside, dressing themselves, feeding themselves from the youngest age. We need to encourage them to become as independent in all their living skills as possible, and we do that from the youngest age. And I've seen too often, children who are 4 years old, 5 years old, still being fed by their parents, or still being dressed by their parents. But, they should be able to do this themselves by that point. And if we keep feeding them and keep dressing them, they will always be dependent on us as adults. That's nice, and I'm sure there are many adults who actually want that and think that's a great thing, keep the family together. But it's not so good for that child. How will they really become good parents themselves if they're not learning how to look after themselves from a young age? And I just, in a country that's changing from Soviet system to a market economy, from country's perspective, it needs a population that can be independent, that can be decision makers, that can initiate. in order to be progressive and economically independent. So it's in everybody's interests, actually, to encourage independence in a child, because that will then change and shape society and help this society to become more diverse, more economically productive, and create families that the children want to come back to, not have to come back to, you know, every Sunday or every holiday. And I think that's what we want really with our kids, that they want to come and see us, not that they have to come and see us.